Go ahead and raise your hand if you were victimized by the Goosebumps series in your childhood, specifically victimized by Slappy, the ventriloquist dummy. Yeah? As a child of the 90s, of course, I was exposed to the R.L. Stine Goosebumps series. Very vivid memories of being with my cousins who had VHS tapes of some of the show, movies, whatever you want to call them, that were the filmed adaptations of the Goosebumps stories. That stays with you, and ironically, back when I was a kid, I wasn't super into horror. I was actually pretty scared of things like that. But looking back now, I'm like, oh, okay, so this makes sense. This was early exposure, and now all the pieces are kind of falling into place here. Those of us over a certain age, especially those of us who did grow up in the 90s, were most likely familiar with Slappy from this series. I think one of the most iconic and terrifying Goosebumps characters ever created. And I'm here today with a book recommendation for those of us that were either terrified of Slappy or super into him and Goosebumps in general. I think what I'm going to present to you today is kind of like the grown-up Night of the Living Dummy, as it were. So before I get into it, welcome back to the channel. To those of you that are new, my name is Carson. I love horror books. I love horror shows, movies, anything, haunted houses, Halloween Horror Nights at Universal Studios in Orlando. If it is horror, I will give it a shot. I really just love the genre as a whole. But today I'm going to be talking about a horror book. This is actually one that I read a couple years ago. I have been thinking about it, sitting on it, reminded of it over the course of the last couple years, and it really does seem like it's time for me to go ahead and talk about this now, especially if you're looking for an interesting summer read of the horror persuasion. Like I said, I love horror fiction. I have been devouring so many horror books. I'm just recently, in the last couple years, back on the reading bandwagon. I kind of fell off for a while because, you know, sometimes you read a really good book and then just no other books will compare. But last year, I just completely went head over heels into the literary world again and consumed a fair number of books, a lot of them being horror. I'm right on that same road again this year. In fact, like 90% of what I've read this year has been horror. But my mind has been coming back to this one book from a couple years ago. This was one that my parents had actually kind of mentioned over the years, but they didn't tell me fully what it was about, and I think that kind of piqued my interest. I ended up looking it up on Amazon and ordering a copy of it for myself. And that book is Magic by William Goldman. So this is an older book. This is from 1976. In fact, I've been kind of in an older horror kick. Definitely some of it is very of the time. You could say that about this book as well. But it's always interesting to see what was considered scary back in different decades and in different time periods. And whoo boy, what a book this is. As you can tell by looking at the cover of the book, it says, "The terrifying love story, now a shattering movie." There is a movie adaptation of this, but I do want to talk about the book first. Unlike the other book reviews that I have done on this channel so far, I really don't want to get too far into the plot and spoil much of anything. I just want to give the premise here because this is one that I would recommend for a fan of a horror or the thriller genre. This one, I think, kind of the less you know going in, the better received it will be. So Magic centers around an entertainer named Corky. He is very, very successful when we first meet him at the start of the book. Came up learning magic through his apprentice that went by the name of Merlin. But Corky was not always such a success. He really struggled in the entertainment world, but his big ticket kind of came through when he introduced a dummy into his routine. His dummy is named Fats. Fats is like Slappy. Actually, I feel like Fats had to walk so Slappy could run in the 90s, because again, this is from the 70s. But Fats is disturbing. That's really the only way I can describe it. I mean, really any sort of dummy is automatically just kind of scary a little bit, but Fats is very off-putting. He refers to Corky as Laddie, and that, I don't know why that little nickname just like under my skin. But he is very scary to imagine in your mind. And in the movie, he was very scary to look at as well. So now that Corky has incorporated fats into his routine, he is performing to sold out audiences. He is famous. He has his pick of any woman just because of his notoriety and his fame. But something is wrong, and we know that something is wrong right from the jump in this book, because some of the sections and segments in this book, at the end, you'll come to the end of a journal entry, let's say, and you'll see the words, "This will be marked Police Exhibit D." So right off the bat, you know, okay, something bad has happened here. And as the book unfolds, we do find out that things are not great in Corky's world. All is not well for this famed entertainer. One thing I really like about this book as well is that parts of it are flashbacks to his childhood, and you learn how he got into magic in the first place. You hear about his home life, and you hear about his childhood crush on a girl named Peggy Ann Snow. And Peggy Ann Snow might just reappear a little bit later on in the novel now that she and Corky are both grown up. So without really spoiling what exactly happens, we follow Corky kind of out of his big performer lifestyle in the big city into a more remote section of the United States. And he's on the hunt for something that he wants to get back from his childhood. And his dummy Fats is going to accompany him along the way. So because you know right from the jump in this book that something has happened, that something is wrong, as you go on this journey with Corky, as you follow him through this kind of crisis that he is having, the sense of dread just mounts and builds on itself, because you're like, oh my God, what are we working up to? What is going to happen? I know something is wrong, but what is it? And you're kind of just like wanting to scream at him, like, what's going on, Corky? Like, get rid of this dummy, please stop. And it kind of makes you feel that same kind of like dread and uncertainty that the main character himself is going through as well. It is an interesting ride. Again, I was deeply kind of disturbed by it and freaked out by it. Is it the bloodiest, goriest, like shock you in your face novel? No. But sometimes that's not really what I'm looking for personally. I'm looking for something more like this book, where that tension and that dread just builds and builds and builds as it goes on. That, and you know, dummies are just inherently scary in general. As I was saying before, some of this novel is very much of the time, but when I read it, I felt like it still held up today. And this was actually not a book that I had really heard of or seen on any lists of horror novels. This was one that my parents had brought up. They'd mentioned it over the years. They said, oh my gosh, that was a wicked book. And I'm glad that I eventually looked it up and decided that I wanted to read it as well. I know sometimes like you have to put yourself in the mindset of when a book was written to kind of get the scary aspects of it. Like, yeah, this probably would have been terrifying in the 70s, but I think this one holds up today. And I wasn't really joking in the beginning when I cited Goosebumps. This really does feel like an adult version of that same Night of the Living Dummy type terror that we experienced, most of us experienced probably when we were kids. And I also mentioned that there is a movie adaptation of this. The movie is also quite older, and they made the amazing decision to cast Anthony Hopkins as Corky in the movie. As book to movie adaptations go, this one I felt was pretty solid. They did unfortunately leave out all of the part about Corky's childhood and his backstory, and I think that part of the book really does kind of inform so much of who he is as an adult. So that piece was kind of missing, but everything set in the present day portion of the novel really held up extremely closely to what went on in the book. And I'm sorry, but Anthony Hopkins is fantastic in anything he's ever been in. So if you want to see a young Anthony Hopkins absolutely deliver in a really kind of creepy movie, I would suggest it. Read the book first though. I know that's such a cliche thing to say, but the book is always better, but it does have a solid movie adaptation as well. I'd love to say more. I know I gave just kind of like a bare bones outline of what the book was about, but it would be such a disservice to this book to fully lay out everything that happens. I am not putting a spoiler section in here. I don't want to dissect it. This is just purely less of a review and more of a recommendation, because I think this is one that you have to read and kind of decide what you think of it for yourself. I think it would be a good summer read. It's not very long. The print in my version, again, is kind of small, and I'm horrible. I have the one with the movie cover on it. I know some people are like purists, but this is the one that I was able to find on Amazon. It was not very expensive. At least it wasn't when I got it 2 years ago. But I do highly recommend this for anybody that's looking for something that's maybe not full tilt horror, ghosts, and things like that, but more of a creepy thriller to evoke that feeling that maybe you got when you were reading Goosebumps as a kid. I myself am constantly on the hunt for more good horror fiction. I'm actually currently in the middle of another horror book from the 1970s that we may have to talk about here. I've got thoughts about this one. But in the meantime, I will be continuing to read and to devour all the horror content. I've got some other books and things that I really do want to talk about and probably do a more in-depth review of in the future. But check out Magic if you're looking for something fun, and in the meantime, enjoy reading whatever you're reading, doing whatever you're doing. It's almost summertime. Let's celebrate that. And I hope to see you again back here on the channel. If you liked what you saw, you can always follow my Instagram. I am on Instagram at HHNCarson. I post random stuff, travel stuff, books that I'm reading. So if you're interested, you can check that out, and I will see you guys next time.